He did it very well in Sweden. And now he's here to talk about other things, not just fiscal policy. Anders Borg, please.
Thank you very much.
It's so good to have you here, Anders.
It's fantastic to be here. A fantastic day and a lot of very exciting information and very interesting to see how the business strategy is evolving from Nederman's.
But you're focusing on so many different aspects now, from small startups to really big companies.
Yeah, I'm a little bit all over the place. I'm a little bit in finance, a little bit in tech, a little bit in media. So I'm trying to be all over the place and try to get all of these rays of light into my prisma.
And even trying to promote the hairdressers in Stockholm.
Absolutely. My wife is starting a tech company for connecting hairdressers, and then you can bring them home to your own place or to your beauty services, or even trim your beard in just 20 minutes in the convenience of your home. So Tritia is a very interesting company. We are starting up in Stockholm, but we're eventually coming also down to Malmö and the rest of Skåne.
And even to Helsingborg, maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the people here in Helsingborg, they're able to just bring home their own hairdresser.
Yeah, I mean, think of a family with 3 or 4 children, and a hairdressing salon is something that you don't want to go to because it's chaotic. Yeah. So you can put some of the children down the front of the TV, and then you can do the hair cutting. Or if you want to do some beauty services, nobody here would need it, but if you would use like Restylane or something like that, you can also do it in the convenience of your home. You don't have to go out and have these dots in your face and so forth. So it's a kind of an interesting space to be in.
You realize that you have a great time ahead of you. Anders Borg, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will try to give a little bit of my reflection based on the companies that I work with and also my experience from economics and finance, and try to distill a couple of clear conclusions for what I think you would have in mind when you are developing Nederman's the years ahead. So I have 3 conclusions. The first one is along the line of what Henrik said, that the global economy is in a soft spot. I don't think we're heading towards a recession. 35 central banks have already cut the rates, and that means that we have a cushion or under demand. But we are seeing a couple of difficult years, particularly for us who are close or nearby Germany, the automotive industry, and have exposure to China. My second conclusion will be that we are in a very exciting time, very much along the lines of what we've heard here about globalization, digitalization, Industry 4.0, but also I would say a little bit about the more difficult and more complicated political conclusions that might come out of that evolving new economic landscape. And then my third point is that I will tell you a little bit what I think a company like Nederman should do when they are trying to navigate in these difficult waters. So starting out with the global economy, it's pretty clear to me that we are seeing a slowdown. And one has to understand that it's fundamentally about China. So the China problem is not that Trump is running a trade war against them. The fundamental problem with China is about indebtedness. So China has increased their debt level with around 80% of the GDP of the last 10 years. We have never seen any country do the same kind of journey as China has. And there is a number of reasons why they've been able to do that and why it is problematic, but maybe also solvable. They had a very low debt level to start with. Almost all the planned economies, the command and control economies, had a very, very low debt ratio when they started out. So China is high, it's comparable to Europe and the US, but it's not exceptional. The second point that I think actually Henrik showed here on one of his graphs, China has a very low foreign indebtedness. So China is not like Russia in 98 or Indonesia in 97 or Argentina at the current junctures. They don't borrow from other countries. The saving rates in China is very, very high. A normal household would save some 30-40% of their income. So that means that when they buy a house, they very rapidly do down payments on it. And they have been running, as you all know, large current accounts surpluses over the last 30-40 years when they have been the export engine of the global economy. So they are not borrowing the same way as these overheated Latin American or Asian economies did back in the 90s. But having said this, it's still a huge problem that has to be dealt with. Deleverage means that you have to recapitalize companies that doesn't work anymore. And there are around 150,000 Chinese state-owned enterprises that, and among of those, they are calculated that some 40,000 or so are probably not viable in a free market economy. They've been living on subsidized land, they've been living on cheap energy, and they've been living on almost free access to capital, and that's not sustainable. It's quite clear that the Chinese are dealing with it. I serve on one of the Stena boards, and we can already see that it's a huge structural change that is not now ongoing in the shipyard industry. So China is not like Europe or the US, where problems build up and they don't deal with them. They're already doing a lot of restructuring, but the scale of this venture is quite massive. We are talking about tens of thousands of companies and maybe up to 10 million people that has to be reallocated on the labor market. They have done that before when they've shut down state-owned enterprises, but in the old environment, they had 10 to 15% growth in the industrial sector with a lot of foreign direct investments coming in. So that meant that they were scaling back their old style of heavy industry while fast-growing exporters just came in and employed all of these people. And now they are doing the restructuring in an environment with much lower growth. So what is really surprising is that the Chinese households are behaving as they were in a debt deleverage process. So consumption is down, savings is up, and we don't really see the numbers add up. So official unemployment is around 5%. And people would not be scared with 5% unemployment. When you see a deleverage process is when unemployment has doubled or tripled. That's the type of environment that you see in Spain or Greece in the crisis of 2008. There has been no real shock of real interest rates in the Chinese economy, but still people are behaving as if they were too indebted. That could be because they are now squeezing credit with their quantitative measures so that people feel that they don't have access to credit and therefore it is the same impact as real interest rates gone up. We haven't seen house prices falling, but that's partly because in the greater cities of the coastal area, they have put administrative restrictions on your ability to sell houses. So it might be that China is actually in a slightly weaker shape than we previously have thought. So China is known to deal with this problem. The problem this time is that it's quite difficult to do it because they have Mr. Trump in the White House. The rational economic policy in a country where you are deleveraging is to cut interest rates, to provide more liquidity into the economy. And while doing that, obviously you need to see the currency depreciate. That is what is happening when you do a much more expansionary monetary policy. To some extent, we've seen that the Chinese RMB, the yuan, has depreciated somewhat, but it's still on a rather strong level. So from a global perspective, when Trump is saying that China is a currency manipulator, it's actually probably the first time in 40, 50 years when they are not manipulating the currency. They were manipulating it. Today they are not. They are trying to prop it up while it probably should be slightly weaker. So I would expect that China would be dealing with this. What they need to do is to open their economy even further. There are strong restrictions of foreign ownership in the Chinese economy, particularly in some of the strategic sectors. So if you want to do a debt restructuring and you don't want your currency to fall, the only logical solution is to allow more capital into your country, more financial institutions and more investors to come. I think this is what the Chinese have been planning to do, but the trade negotiations have been too slow, and now they probably need to do something along these lines themselves. So China is slowing. And why is this important for us here in Helsingborg and Sweden and Northern Europe? Well, the numbers are today quite staggering. If you go back to 2010, China consumed 10 million cars per year. They reached 20 million cars a couple of years ago. And if the trend would have continued, they should have this year or next year have reached 30 million cars. At the current rate, we saw the latest numbers coming out of July, it is quite likely that China will only consume 15 or 16 million cars. So the global car industry is missing some 10 to 15 million cars. That's a lot. that's actually more than the full year consumption in the United States. It's actually more than Germany, France, Spain, and UK together. So we are really seeing a shock to the global car industry that is of unprecedented scale. And this tells us something. So car sales have moved to Asia. 44 million cars are now sold in the whole Asian region, which should be compared with 14 million in the US and some 15, 16 million in Europe. And when they get a cold, we get a heavier sickness here in Europe, because we are producing for China and we are interconnected. And I think we are going to see a couple of years when growth in China are slower. I've worked a lot with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Chinese leadership in my different roles, and I'm convinced that they will deal with it. They will deregulate some of the sectors. They are doing quite a large fiscal expansion, almost 3% of GDP. They are willing to open up the HOCO system so you get more labor market flexibility. And fundamentally, they will provide credit for the SME companies and the households, so the Chinese economy will continue to move. But the problem is that we in Sweden and we in Northern Europe are excessively depending on the auto industry. And you know that because we have Scania, we have Volvo, but we also have Autoliv and Haldex, and SSAB is producing steel for them. And basically the whole heavy industry structures of Northern Europe is to some extent one way or the other related to the car industry. So I think we will feel this. And the problem here is that for the European car industry, Mr. Trump is really important. So there are some particular features between Europe and US where actually I would say that Mr. Trump is right. When Europe has high customs on cars, while US have low customs, it's illogical. Why should the US accept that Germany, and particularly Volkswagen, is exporting more than 400,000 cars to the US, and they have no production whatsoever in the USA? The full Volkswagen production employment in the USA is 2,000 or 3,000 people. They have put a whole production down in Mexico. This is not true for Volvo. It is not true for WM. It's not true for some of the other European car makers, but it is true for Volkswagen. So the only solution for a European-US trade deal is that the German government and German car manufacturers decides to increase their production with a couple of 100,000 cars and trucks in the US. But then we come back to what we were told here about the climate change and consumer behavior. So Volkswagen needs to build something like 2 or 3 Torslandaverket in the US. They need to do that with a planning horizon for the next 3, 4, or 5 decades. If you build that type of plant, you want to be able to run it for a very long time. And what are you going to produce? Are you going to produce diesel cars? Are they going to have a petrol engine? Is there going to be a gear? Do we need a power transformation? Or is this going to be all electrical cars? And we don't have to be angry at Volkswagen for not being able to make up their mind on what to produce, because we don't know what will be the global car industry within 20 or 30 years. And that, I think, is a major factor. So the combination of China, the trade war with Trump, and a change in consumer behavior is now putting the whole of the German car industry in question. And that means that we have a lot of uncertainty, anxiety in Europe. And on top of that, we're also adding the Brexit problem. And I won't go through all the details and all the complications and all of the alternatives that we have in front of us. I think the brunt of this is it's uncertain, it's uncontrollable, and it's complex. And this means that you will reduce your exposure to the UK. It means that asset prices for the UK and interest rates and other stuff will be more volatile. I'm not very pessimistic about the UK if you take a 10-year or even 5-year perspective. It's a knowledge economy. 40% of all AI in Europe is done in the UK. The pharmaceutical cluster between Oxford and Cambridge is fantastic. So I think the UK will manage. But for the next 5 or 6 months, It's going to be very, very complex. If you just calculate that the handling time for every truck would increase with 2 or 3 minutes, which sounds like a rather small number, we are in a worst case scenario. So the Londoners, they get their vegetables from auctions in Amsterdam that are closed at 1 o'clock at night. Then the truckers and the ferries are bringing it over to London, and it's in the shops at around 5 to 6 in the morning so that it can be put out on the shelves and everything works. With a 3-minute delay for every truck, the queues will go to Paris and Amsterdam. We will have a logistic nightmare in Europe with this Brexit thing. And it will have a negative impact for growth in the short term. On top of that, I think we also have a huge underlying European problem that we will have to deal with sooner or later. And that is that the Eurozone is not really constructed as a viable economic unit. And the problem is not the Germans. The Germans are fine. They are producing great Audis and BMWs and other cars and stuff that we like. The problem is that Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece have not been able to produce the same type of productivity numbers for the last 40 years. And if you look at the features of the Italian, Spanish, Greek, and Portugal society, it's unlikely that they will be able to fix this in any near future. Fundamentally, their productivity has been low because they spend about half as much as we do on education, because they spend a third of what we spend on research and development, because their infrastructure investments are lower, because their labor market is overregulated, because their tax regime is a heavy burden for people working, and because their regime for investment capital and entrepreneurships are much worse. These are fundamental factors that cannot be changed in 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. It's a fundamental transformation. And as long as you have locked the currencies inside of the Eurozone, this is a fundamental pressure cooker that will sooner or later create new problems. And that could probably be dealt with and you push it further away. But it is fundamentally a tension within the European system. So Italy has not once in the last 20 years been able to have a wage increase that is actually strengthening their competitive position. Not 1 year. Every year, wages have increased more than in competitive countries and more than productivity allows. So this is not a problem that is self-healing. It's a problem that is accumulating over the years. And this, I think, one has to understand that we will have financial turbulence coming back to the Eurozone if we would have a broader global slowdown. So therefore, I think one has to be quite mindful of where we are for the next coming years. There is no crisis, because 35 central banks have already cut the rates, and fundamentally the US economy is doing fairly well. If you look at the productivity numbers in the US, they are now again about 2%. So we are seeing investments coming back in the US, and you see fundamentally that they can provide companies like Facebook, Google, and others that are able to transform themselves and to grow very rapidly into strong global positions. So I think as long as the US economy is doing well and interest rates are low, I think the world economy will continue to move forward. But for us in this region, I think we need to be aware that there is a risk that we will see a more deep slowdown in Germany, and particularly in the auto industry. So having said this, I will now turn page and be slightly more optimistic.
Yes.
So we do have some short-term issues that we will have to live with. I think that the long-term mega trends in economics and technology are fundamentally positive. So I might have sounded now that I was kind of gloomy, but also this year we will have more than 3 billion people growing faster than 6%. Compounded interest means that 6% growth will triple their living standard within 20 years. 6% growth means that they are doing the journey that we did, going from one of the poorest countries in the world to a rich welfare state. We did it in 160 years. They are likely to do it in 60 years, which is obviously much slower than the 40 years it took China. But when you have 5 billion people in Asia growing and moving forward with some fundamental reasons for growing, then one should be also optimistic. And I think that we have thanks to the Chinese, changed the perspective on how you do growth. If you want to have a growing economy, anybody can tell you how to do it. First of all, open yourself to the global economy. You need to be an export-oriented country to be able to grow fast. That's a fundamental fact today, and nobody's really questioning it. What we are seeing in India, Indonesia, and so forth is that people are actually opening their economies. In spite of the trade war, they are opening their economies for more foreign direct investments and for more technology to come in. Secondly, I think a fundamental shift has turned the page on how we view children and education. So it was not vice planners that decided that Asian families should put their children in tuition and to give much emphasis to homework than they did previously. There was a fundamental shift in the Asian society where knowledge and work hard in your education became an ethical value. And it's pretty clear that this is spreading. All parents understand that their children need to have a better education today and tomorrow than they had in the past. So there is a strong tendency for educating your children much better than the historical case. And then you also have fundamentally a different view today on stability. So almost none of the Asian economies have high inflation, high budget deficits, high indebtedness, or even current account deficits. If you look at India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and China, all of these countries are fundamentally geared towards macroeconomic stability. So when you have openness, when you invest in education, when you uphold macroeconomic stability and start to open up for more of free market economy, you will fundamentally start to transform your societies. And that is what we are now seeing with Asia. So the best guess is that we will have around 3 billion people today in the global middle class. But before 2030, there will be 5 billion global consumers. And when I was young, there was less than 1 billion middle class consumers in the world. And we had more than 3 billion people living in poverty. Today we are heading towards 500 million people in poverty and 5 billion people in the global middle class. They won't be middle class as us. They won't drive Mercedes-Benz and wear ties from Hermes. But they will shop in stores. They will have a house with running water. They will have basic sanity. They will have some basic health care for the children. And 95% of the children will learn how to read and write. And they will work with electrical equipment and be a part of the industrial society, exporting and importing into the global world market. And that's a fundamental shift. And it's ongoing and it's going fast. You know that we're heading towards a world where most people will be living in urban areas, most people will be educated, and they will be a part of the world market. And fundamentally, I think this is ongoing. And we will see more of it the next few years ahead of us. So my second optimistic point is obviously about technology. So what we are now seeing is a shift of technology that is unprecedented. My father was a young AI engineer in the 60s at Atlas Copco, and they worked for, I think, 3 years to try to build a management system for Atlas Copco together with IBM so that they could steer the whole company with just the computers. Obviously, that failed, and the project was closed down, and I could move to Norrköping instead of being a Stockholmer when I was a kid, which is obviously something that we all appreciate. Why? What is it that has really changed since the 1960s? Well, first of all, it's the connectivity. I mean, these devices are fantastic. Obviously, they have more computer power than you had when you used to run these big computer systems. But they're also producing data. So the data increase still in Ericsson, Telia, or Tele2 networks are at a year-on-year average rate increasing with some 40% per year. So we have a fundamental data explosion. And that in combination with our processing power is the combination that really has done AI possible today. The fundamental ideas about a predictability from statistics, that language can be optimized as a mathematical process. All of these ideas comes from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But you could not put them into a computer. You could not create algorithms that created this kind of learning loops, and therefore it wasn't possible. So these are, I think it was a very good point made when we were talking about Amazon. These are known technologies, but you have added them together, and now they are providing a kind of giant quantitative leap in terms of what you can do with it. So I work with one of the biggest AI companies in the US called IPsoft. We are the biggest privately held AI company, and slightly bigger than IBM in terms of revenues on AI. And I will give you a few of the complex processes that we are working on. So we took over the customer service for Telefonica in Latin America in May. And May is, as you know, a couple of months away, not a couple of years away. So we were running 100,000 calls for them per day before the summer. Now we are doing 250,000 calls a day. 83% of these calls are cleared. We say within 5 minutes, but it's actually less than 1 minute that we clear these calls. It used to take more than 30 minutes. On average, it took 11 minutes before somebody even gave you an answer. And now you're fundamentally have your issue solved in less than a minute, and it's actually without any human communication, because you're basically speaking through a natural language process or texting directly with the computer system that can understand your intent, can understand how you feel, and also resolve most of your issues. You need a new SIM card, you don't want to have this roaming charge, you have already paid the bill, you don't know why it has not been registered, or you want to change your number. All of this can now be done in a fully automatic AI system. So Telefonica is heading towards 250 million calls per year. 250 million calls per year. So obviously this is a process that will reduce costs rapidly, improve service, and have a dramatic impact on the way that you can build a business process. We're also doing a quite fascinating project with BlackRock, which is the largest asset managers in the world with some 6.5 trillion under management. So they are building a full AI process. So humans will be speaking to humans, but any document that you need will come up where the AI assistant will provide it. Any questions you have, how much carbon oxide do I have in my pension plans? And then they can say, well, your exposure is on average 11.3. So you will have all the data. The whole process will also be documented, and you will have automatic compliance. So they think that they can, I won't give the numbers because I probably are not allowed, but they think that they can increase the number of clients served per staff dramatically, because the whole process is basically automated. I would suspect that they would also fundamentally eventually actually just use the automatic process. So we are seeing that really big industries like banking, telecommunication, and others are now applying AI. Banks are doing the biggest investments. They invest 4 times more than telecos and are now the biggest spenders on tech of all companies globally, which is a kind of a fundamental shift. But that's because almost anything in banking are now being transformed by digitalization. Asset management, obviously. Payments, so Alipay, the Chinese payment company, they are now transforming payments at a cost difference to a US bank of 98%. That's a quite big difference in cost, I would say, 98%. That will imply that Alipay will be growing. So I remember when I worked for the World Economic Forum and Alipay launched their first asset management project. That was 2015, which is not 100 years ago. They have gone from 0 clients in 2015 to almost 400 million clients in less than a 5-year period. So what this brings out is that the digitalization is fundamentally different when it's combined with AI than any technological process that we heard about. So we talked about combustion engines, we talked about railways, computers, and all of the other things. And all of these technological shifts had taken some time, maybe 1 or 2 generations to become widely used, and also it's taken a couple of decades for them to transform the rest of industry. The reason for this is, and you remember from your old school days, that we have demand and supply. So the more you wanted to supply, the higher the price went. That was the fundamental demand and supply equations of any microeconomic course that you ever took. The reason that the supply curves look like this is not that I want to do this, dancing, but the fact that you have diminishing return of scale. So when you added resources, they were slightly less productive than the earlier resources. But if you have constant diminishing cost, constant increasing return on scale, because when you do a digital copy of a product, it's no worse than the previous one, and it's basically an 85% margin revenue for a new client. So these companies can scale out in a pace towards on a global markets that we've probably never seen before. It took Christianity around 2,000 years to reach 500 million people. It took Angry Birds 35 days. So I think we have to accept that ideas in the digital world can spread like wildfires. They can become global within weeks and months. And that's a huge difference, because this implies that the return on innovation, the return on knowledge, and the growth of knowledge is exploding. So the number of scientific papers that are now published has increased year on year with 8%. And I like compounded interest impact. This means that we double our scientific production every 9th year. So it's pretty clear that we can produce more knowledge, we can spread it within weeks, days, and months, and we can also have people that actually are literate and can understand and can be a part of this dialogue. And the big change that has also happened is that we also have VC firms and startup companies and unicorns capitalists that create these new billion-dollar companies and then reinvest back into new companies. Nederman, to some extent, is an example of this. The Douglas family that founded a fantastic Assa Abloy and securities companies, or at least developed them, are now reinvesting money into Nedermans and other businesses. And it's a huge difference if you have a competence capitalist that comes with experience and skills and invest into a company. Because they are not bringing only money as a bank, they're also bringing these networks and knowledge on how to build a global company. So the capitalist structures that used to be that we lock innovations into big old hierarchical structures, they have rapidly been broken down over the last 10 to 20 years. And this is a fantastic change, I think. So I think fundamentally, globalization and digitalization is have an optimistic impact on our worldview. But then I have to speak a little bit about climate and also the political implications of this. So I won't say so much because we already had a very good presentation, so I'm now skipping a part on the climate. But I do think that the political implications of this are quite worrisome. And it's because it has to do with power, it has to do with poverty, and it has to do with inequality. So power. Why is power affected? Well, I'm not a Marxist, but the fundamental production forces are deciding the ideological superstructures and power relationships. And when 5 billion Asians will dominate the global economy, there is a huge shift going on. It might not be so difficult for us in Europe. We already know that we are kind of the little brother in the global system. But how will the US react to this? What will be the impact on the fundamental power balance in the world? And this is not easy and uncomplicated to understand, because it will imply that the way that the Chinese and the Asians look at the world will be a much more dominating force than we are used to. The global order with free trade and all of these democracy and values that we believed in, they will be there, but they will be in a different context. And it's always been these power shifts that have created a lot of conflicts and destructive political movements. And I don't think we really understand what this shift will mean, and I don't think we really understand how we should orient ourselves in this world. But I think we have to understand that it will happen. We might not like it, but 5 billion nations with a strong ethical outlook for education, hard work, saving, innovating, they will become a dominant part of the global economy, and we will just have to accept and live with that. But it might create a lot of friction. My second point is about poverty. So if you have 3 billion people growing at 6%, the last 5-year period, we also have 1 billion people that have actually experienced lower living standard. So GDP per capita has been falling for almost 1 billion people over the last 5 years. The problem is that almost all of these people are in the Middle East and North Africa. Some of them are also in South Africa, and it depends on where you calculate Nigeria. But fundamentally, North Africa, Middle East are a place where it's almost impossible to see strong growth coming. And none of these countries have, for the last 20 years, been able to produce these 5, 6, 7% growth numbers that we need to see to be able to transform a country. And the problem is that the population in those countries are now at the most difficult stage when young men are dominating. And young, dissatisfied men is a force for a society that's not contributing to stability. It might have implications for security in terms of the conflicts that we've seen coming out of religion, ethnicity. It might have impacts on migration patterns, where the Mediterranean and Middle East is obviously connected, and we might see effects out of that on Europe. So poverty is not easily fixed in these countries, because fundamentally you erase poverty by having a strong government that invests in infrastructure and education, that uphold the legal system, that opens markets to competition, which means that you undermine monopolistic profits, but that also normally means that you undermine the crony capitalist structures that are holding these countries in a grip. So you need to see a real modern transformation to see these countries succeed. This could happen. I would say that in the Middle East and North Africa, you have a couple of countries that has this potential. First and foremost, Turkey. So in 2000, 37% of the Turkish population were living in poverty. Today it's less than 7%. So if Turkey would go back to high growth, like they did for the last 20 years before the last 3 or 4 years when they've entered into macroeconomic instability, that could be a transformational phase. If Egypt would follow, and you would see this transformation of Saudi Arabia succeeding, then it's possible that we can see the Middle East and North Africa becoming a part of a global growth compact. But today, I would say they are a source of poverty and therefore a source of instability. And on top of that, I would like to add the third force that I find quite challenging and difficult to deal with, and that is inequality. So over the last 20, 30 years, the average worker in the US have not received any better standard of living than he had in 1980 or 1990. While on the same time that the top percent has actually increased their value enormously in the USA and Europe and elsewhere. So return on capital has gone up, while return on labor has gone down. The only way that we can get that old compact in the industrial society to work again is to get productivity up. Because it's only when productivity increases 2 or 3% per year, we can provide everybody with a better living standard. And the fact that we have seen productivity at around 0.5 percentage point over the last 10 years is really, really frightening. We need to do the necessary structural reforms to get dynamism, entrepreneurship, investments back, to really have the fundamental social contract that we created under industrialization back. And that compound is, we work hard, we save our money, and therefore our living standard is increasing. And therefore we need to do much, much more structural reforms, particularly here in Europe, because US is already seeing productivity coming up again, while we tend to be much more stagnated. So I think there are some political reasons to be worried, and these political reasons produce political leaders like Trump, Putin, Modi, Abe, Xi, Duterte. It's not Trump that is unique. He is actually one of the latecomers to this game that Putin and others started out some 10 to 15 years ago, where nationalism and populism is combined into a kind of quite conflict-oriented political message. And that, I think, is a huge challenge. And I'm not a politician anymore, so I don't have to provide answers. I only have to think about what a company should do in this environment. So what should a company do in this world? Well, companies are fundamentally directed towards growing and dealing with opportunities. That's what you do in the business sector. And therefore, I think the digitalization and globalization will, in the long run, provide opportunities for well-run companies. And to my mind, I think in the short term, one has to be slightly more cautious, because we have a slower growth in Northern Europe. We have slower growth in the auto industry, and therefore one has to be more prudent in 2020 and 2021 than under normal circumstances. So one has to be cautious about liquidity, one has to be cautious about securing credits, and one has to be adapted to the fact that there might come need for cost programs, and be very cautious on taking on big cost increases in this environment. Because we are in an environment where even if demand is good today, the risk that this automotive crisis is spreading over to other industrial sectors, I think has to be taken quite serious. So when I do my thinking and on the boards that I serve, I think one should have contingency planning where you secure liquidity, where you're cautious about your indebtedness, and where you're also staying very, very close to your clients. One of the core messages that we heard from this stage was stay close to your client. Be the one that is crucial for the client and has the best understanding, and therefore has the biggest opportunity to adapt to this changing environment with your clients. If it's important to be client-oriented in any time, it is super important now. Be close to the clients and really understand their needs and take care of their anxiety and be a part of their solution. But having said this, on the short term, fundamentally, I think a company like Nederman has to be future-proof. And I think this type of discussions that we had today are very much about how to become that. And I think a fundamental insight from all the different companies that I work with is that you have to be agile and oriented towards innovation, which means that you have to be able to experiment and fail fast. You have to have shorter innovation cycles, and you have to have projects that you allow to be tested, but then close down. So you adapt more like a biological mechanism in terms of evolution than by being completely secure on what to do and in what direction to go. Experimenting, testing, being close to clients, cautious on costs, and then try to adapt to this new environment. So I think agility, innovation, fail fast, and also copy with pride. Remember that if somebody else is doing an innovation, copy it fast. Don't be the Nokia of the world that is sitting in the board and saying, well, these mobile phones from Apple, I mean, it's Apple. It's not even a mobile company. We don't want that kind of scrappy products. Be the ones that see change coming. And it's better to copy fast and copy with pride than to be left behind. So in any world that is much more fast in change, innovation and fail fast and then copy are, I think, three kind of mindsets that one has to have to be able to be strong in this environment. And I think one should be fundamentally optimistic about what your company is doing for two reasons. A, the business idea, it's pretty clear. We provide clean air. I mean, it's pretty clear that that's going to be something that we'll also be needing in the future. And secondly, you are organizing these types of events to create the mindset that are adapted to change, to build a culture within the company, to understand the outside world, to bring stakeholders together and adapt to change. And that's a big part of becoming successful, that you're already inviting this kind of discussions into your company. So my insights are pretty simple. We are heading towards a couple of tough years. In the long term, there are fundamental opportunities in technology and globalization. And your ability to be agile, adapt, and be innovative is the key elements of building a success in that environment. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Anders. Copy fast. Do it with pride.
I think that's a fundamental insight from the companies that I work with. That don't feel that if somebody else innovated it, well, then it's dangerous. If somebody did something well, copy it. Copy with pride.
Is that a recipe for Europe as well? I mean, in terms of, we talked about the transformation in the US, where they slowly but surely realize that Asia is taking market shares, while we in Europe have already realized that someone else is ahead. What could we do in Europe? Copy with pride, or?
Well, I mean, that's a kind of fundamental policy issue. I would take 2 points, one from Asia and one from the US. From the US, I would obviously take and copy the entrepreneurial culture. The fact that they have printed some 50, 60 unicorns over the last 10 years, companies growing to $1 billion in valuation in less than 5 years, while we in France, Spain, Italy, Portugal have seen none of them. We have 4 or 5 in Germany. We have 4 or 5 in Sweden. The UK have 6 or 7. But a large part of Europe doesn't have the entrepreneurial climate that is absolutely necessary to create growth. From Asia, well, that's probably something for us in the Nordics that we should have remembered. Education, education, education. I mean, if there's some value that we had in our cultures that we really were instilling in our children, it was the value of knowledge, hard study, and education. And I mean, the Finns have kept to it, but I think not the least we in Sweden have downplayed education when we should have upgraded it.
Vietnam, as we touched upon earlier today, has already surpassed Sweden in terms of the Pisa survey, Pisa scoring. So the 15-year-olds in Vietnam is now above the Swedish.
That's worrying.
Is a bit sad.
Yeah, it's very worrying.
Yeah. Do we have any questions out here? You're so polite. There's one over there.
So you talked about AI replacing positions. So I guess I'm just curious your comments and thoughts about what happens to all those displaced workers and how that's going to impact the economy moving forward.
Yeah, that's a kind of very difficult, the billion-dollar question I think we're trying to face. If I answer as an economic researcher, I would obviously give you the standard answer saying, well, technological change has always implied higher productivity, higher wages, and therefore demand has driven new employment. So from the Industrial Revolution to today, employment rate have gone up. And you could probably argue that to some extent Sweden is and the Nordics are a case, because we are having more value added production than in most, and are more digital than most, and our employment rates are very high. And it's a little bit striking that this round of rapid digitalization in the US, UK, Germany, Japan has been combined with the lowest unemployment rate that we've seen in decades. So it's pretty clear that the US is able to do this transformation with less than 4% unemployment. But I still think that this is a big issue, because it's kind of, we get super wages for AI programmers, while we are going to see a lot of routine work being kind of displaced by technology. And you could say it's not a problem if you can turn 50% of all children into AI engineers, but we can't. Our schooling system really doesn't give us that kind of fundamental mathematical background that you need for matrix algebra and the stuff that is involved in AI. So I think it's going to be a huge issue. I think we in the Nordics have done a decent job so far, because we provide good health care, good child care, and good elderly care without cost, regardless of your income and your work status. And that is a good way of distributing income. But I must say, I don't have the answer. I think what I said on the political side was slightly negative. And if I would have added your argument, I think it's become even more difficult. What are we going to do with all of these people that don't want to be social, don't want to work in the welfare system, doesn't want to provide services, and doesn't want to do the schooling that is required for being an engineer or a kind of a productive worker in the AI world? So no, I won't say that I have an answer. I think it will be a factor contributing to social conflict and dissatisfaction.
A reflection from you, Sven?
Yeah, a few reflections. One is obviously that two of you are saying that inflation is dead, basically. So you should call for a conference with all the central bankers because they claim it should be 2%. That is one reflection. And that reflection also have an impact on our business. The second one is we should move R&D to China since we should copy more.
Well, I think the inflation conclusion is very difficult to come around. Inflation will be very low. If you would bring the global macroeconomists and central bankers together, they would say that would actually call for a higher inflation target, maybe go to 3 or 4%, and thereby being even more expansionary and pushing even more quantitative measures into our economy, because it's obvious that the amount of liquidity that we have is not enough to push up inflation. And if inflation is too low and you go into a global downturn, you get stuck with this zero boundness problem that interest rates cannot go too much negative. So no, I think the central bankers of the world are quite frightened and quite uncertain on what to do in this environment. It's not that they are confident and know exactly what to do. I think they are very, very, very worried of where we are.
But it's funny with the central banks that they seem to be so, they agree on most things. Like it's reasonable to have negative rates, it's reasonable to have a 2% inflation target. And that's really funny because that's such a huge shift. And still in most parts of the world or most parts of society, if you're part of a sporting club or whatever, you disagree on some things. Like sort of what the t-shirts should look like in the junior team in soccer. But when it comes to negative rates, they all seem to agree, and they even look the same. They're all 63 years old, and they've been educated on the same schools. It's just, that's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but it's worrying, and they would agree with your part of the worrying. But I mean, I can't really see what is the solution here. I mean, the zero boundness problem is real. If we would go into a recession now, monetary policy will be extremely inefficient because we will have the zero boundness. Yep. So it has the implication that it's much, much more difficult today to create demand artificially with interest rates. And okay, there are some countries like China that can do some fiscal stuff, but for most of Europe, the fiscal gun is empty. You don't have any ammunition left. If you're France with 90% indebtedness, or Italy with 120, or Greece with 150, or whatever it is currently. So no, it's a very worrying period for economic policy. So they might be agreeing, but they are only agreeing on how constrained they are. It's not that they have an agreement on some brilliant solution. And I mean, almost all the solutions will have to involve not fiscal policy and monetary policy, but structural measures, increasing pension age, deregulating labor market, introducing wage flexibility, strengthening education system, investing in infrastructure. But all of these stuff are extremely unpopular. There are almost only one government in Europe that is doing structural reforms currently, and that's Macron. And he is not very popular in France. No.
But I think it's also important, we will enter into a political problem. You had a slide with someone reclining on a number of dollars or whatever, because you could come into this inequality, social disturbance and politics, and people with simple one-issue solution to everything. And that is why I share your political uneasy feeling about the political system and how that will cope with this.
No, I think as a company you will, you have to kind of take into account that political uncertainty has gone up. The risk of legislative change, of populist attacks on your business, all of that, those factors I think are more important today than they were. Because there are very few political constituencies today that are calm, stable, and growth-oriented. So Switzerland is doing fairly well. Singapore is doing fairly well. But then the number of countries that are doing fairly well are quite short. I mean, the oldest, most pragmatic party in the world is the Tory party. When I was a kid, I used to read Churchill's speeches, and that was kind of, the kind of politics that I like. Pragmatism and value and common sense. And today they are probably the maddest party in Europe. And kind of...
Despite having a party leader who has actually written a book about Churchill.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we cannot end this discussion on such a negative note. So I know you like figures. So I thought, if we think about your speech in 3 parts, we have the soft spot, that's a -1.
Yeah.
Then we have IT globalization.
6.
That's a +3.
6%.
Okay, it's a +6.
6%.
Okay, yeah, so but in this grading system.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have -1 and +6. And then we have inequality power shift.
Bad.
That's a minus.
Yeah, maybe 2.
Okay, so -3 and +6.
So it's a +3.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much, Anders Borg.
Which is also, by the way, the forecast for the global economy. So that's how you do it.
Exactly.